"That man right there," she said, barely dropping her voice, "is worth more than this entire building." The man she was pointing at smiled like he already owned the room. "Introduce yourself," she said. "He should know who he's standing next to." The stranger extended his hand. "Damien Voss. I'm sure you've heard the name." "Can't say I have." "Then you're one of the few." She laughed at that, the particular laugh she reserved for moments when she wanted someone to feel small by comparison. What none of them knew was that the man she'd brought to humiliate her husband, the one she'd been introducing for 6 weeks as a billionaire with ties to 3 continents, had spent the last 4 minutes quietly sweating through a pressed collar. Because the man he'd just extended his hand to controlled the company whose board he had spent 11 months trying to defraud. What does a man do when the person sent to replace him walks directly into the room he already owns? If this is the kind of story that makes you feel something, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without it. Marcus Hale was 41 years old, and the only thing most people knew about him was that he drove a 7-year-old Tacoma with a cracked passenger side mirror and that he'd worked in facilities management for the better part of a decade. That was the version he maintained carefully. The one he'd chosen the way a craftsman chooses the right grade of sandpaper, deliberately with a specific outcome in mind. The truck was real. The apartment near the industrial corridor was real. The lunch he ate at the same diner counter 3 days a week was real. None of it was a lie. It was simply an incomplete picture. And he'd learned long ago that most people were satisfied with an incomplete picture if it confirmed what they already believed about someone. The reason Marcus had learned that lesson was a man named Gerald Whitmore, his first business partner, whom he'd trusted with everything he'd built before the age of 32, and who had walked out of a mediation meeting with 53% of a logistics company Marcus had funded from his own savings over 6 years. The settlement was legal, the betrayal was total. Marcus had not spoken about it publicly in the 9 years since. What he had done instead was rebuild carefully through holding structures and property trusts and a small infrastructure fund that grew quietly the way certain trees grow, adding mass where nobody thinks to measure it. By the time he met Serena Caldwell at a mutual friend's dinner in the spring, he was managing assets that would have changed the temperature of the room if anyone in that room had known the number. Nobody knew the number. That was the point. Serena was warm that first evening. She was curious without being invasive, and she laughed at a story Marcus told about a burst pipe at one of the facilities he managed. A story that was technically accurate and contained no lie except the one she was constructing in her own mind about what kind of man told stories like that. He didn't correct her understanding. They exchanged numbers. 3 weeks later they had dinner alone, and she told him that she appreciated how grounded he was, that most men she'd dated had been obsessed with appearances, with what things looked like from outside. He said he understood that. He said he'd known men like that too. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and Marcus felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 9 years, which was the quiet and slightly terrifying sensation of wanting to trust someone again. They were married 14 months later, on a Saturday in October at a small venue in the hills outside the city, with 43 guests and no photographer flown in from anywhere because neither of them had insisted on that. Marcus's lawyer, Oliver Reed, sat in the 3rd row and said nothing when Marcus caught his eye before the vows. Oliver knew everything. Oliver had always known everything. That was what Oliver was for. The first year was uncomplicated in the way that first years sometimes are. Not perfect, not effortless, but genuine. Serena worked in brand consulting, and she was good at it. Marcus let her believe he found her job fascinating, which he did, and he let her believe he found his job modest, which served its purpose. They disagreed about small things and resolved them quickly. She wanted to move to a larger apartment. He suggested they wait. She wanted to take a trip to the Maldives. He found a place on the coast that was quieter and less expensive, and she conceded and then found it beautiful. The friction was manageable. The affection was real. He still believed that in the 2nd year, which was when things began to shift in a way that was easy to miss if you weren't watching for the specific mechanism that was causing it. The mechanism was Serena's mother, a woman named Patricia Caldwell, who had opinions about income the way some people have opinions about religion: absolute, hierarchical, and tolerant of no revisionism. Patricia was 63, had been comfortably maintained through 2 divorces and a settlement from a commercial property dispute that she referenced frequently without ever specifying its terms, and she had known from the first time Serena brought Marcus to a family dinner that he was, as she put it to her sister, a temporary decision. She never said this to Marcus directly. She said other things directly. She said them over holiday meals and Sunday afternoon visits, in the particular register of a woman who has learned to phrase dismissal as concern. "Does Marcus have any interest in professional development?" she asked Serena once, within Marcus's earshot, while Marcus was standing at the kitchen counter opening a bottle of wine. "Only because I read an article about facilities technicians and the upward mobility is it's limited, isn't it? I just want to make sure you're both planning for the future." Marcus set the bottle on the counter and poured the wine. He didn't say anything. That was always his first response, and it was never misread. It was read as having nothing to say. The second year became the third, and Patricia's observations became more frequent as Serena's consultancy grew and her income increased, which created a comparative gap that Patricia found both troubling and useful. By the start of the 4th year, Serena had begun to hesitate before answering when colleagues asked what her husband did, a hesitation so small that most people wouldn't notice it. But Marcus noticed it because he noticed everything. Because noticing everything was the discipline that had rebuilt him after Gerald Whitmore walked out of that mediation room with 53% of 6 years of his life. He watched the hesitation and said nothing. He was patient in the way that men who have been thoroughly destroyed once tend to be patient, not passive, not resigned, but genuinely willing to wait for information to become complete before making a decision. The information became more complete in the spring of that 4th year when a man named Damien Voss appeared. Damien Voss arrived in Serena's life the way disruptions often arrive, through an introduction that seemed incidental and turned out not to be. He was brought to a networking event by a client of Serena's consultancy, introduced as a private equity partner with interests in luxury real estate and emerging hospitality markets across Southeast Asia, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of someone who has spent considerable effort learning to read a room and enter it at precisely the right angle. He was 44. He wore a watch that cost more than the annual salary of any facilities technician in the greater metropolitan area, and he mentioned within 11 minutes of meeting Serena that he had recently closed a deal involving a property portfolio in Kuala Lumpur that he described only as significant, which was a word that did a great deal of work in his vocabulary. Serena mentioned him to Marcus that evening with a tone that was carefully neutral, which was itself a kind of information. "There was someone interesting at the event," she said. "A private equity guy. Very connected." "Connected to what?" Marcus asked. "Just people, money. He knows a lot of the right people." Marcus nodded and asked her how the food was. She told him about the food. The name Damien Voss did not come up again that evening, but it surfaced 12 days later when Serena mentioned a business lunch that had apparently been scheduled, and then again 3 weeks after that when Damien's name appeared in a thread of messages that Serena was reading while Marcus was clearing dishes, and which she closed before he could see the content. A gesture so practiced it was clearly not the first time she'd made it. Marcus said nothing that evening either. He was building a picture, and he needed more of it before he decided what to do. Damien Voss began appearing at social occasions, first at a gallery opening that Serena invited Marcus to, where Damien arrived separately and greeted Serena with the specific warmth of someone who has recently upgraded the nature of an acquaintance, then at a dinner party hosted by one of Serena's clients, where Damien sat across from Marcus for 2.5 hours and talked at considerable length about a marina development project he claimed to be anchoring in the Mediterranean, citing a figure of around $340 million with the casualness of someone describing a grocery trip. Marcus listened. Damien glanced at Marcus 3 or 4 times during the meal with the expression of someone confirming that a calculation they've already completed remains accurate. At no point did Damien appear to register Marcus as anything other than exactly what Marcus presented himself as. That was, as Marcus would later explain to Oliver Reed, Damien Voss's single most consequential error. What Patricia Caldwell had begun to say openly by this point at a Sunday dinner 6 weeks after Damien Voss first appeared in Serena's life was that it was wonderful that Serena had professional peers of such substance to spend time with. Someone who operates at that level, Patricia said, refilling her own glass without offering to refill anyone else's, who really understands what it means to build something, that kind of energy is important. It's important to be around people who are building, not just maintaining. The word maintaining landed in the room and sat there for a moment. Marcus ate his food. He asked Patricia if she'd like more of the roasted carrots he'd made. She said she was watching her sodium. The discovery happened on a Wednesday, and it happened because of a file that was not meant for Marcus to see, which was itself instructive. Because the people who placed that file in a system they believed he had no access to had made the foundational mistake of not knowing what he had access to. Marcus had built, in the years before meeting Serena, a habit of quarterly financial audits conducted by a small forensic accounting firm he'd used since the Reconstruction period after the Whitmore settlement. The firm was called Kessler Advisors, run by a woman named Paige Kessler, who was methodical and unsentimental and who had, over the course of 9 years, developed a precise understanding of how Marcus structured his holdings and a correspondingly precise instinct for when something in the periphery of those holdings looked irregular. On the second Wednesday in October of that year, Paige called Marcus at 11 in the morning and asked if he had a few minutes to talk about something she'd found while cross-referencing filings from a trust account Serena had signing authority over as part of their household financial arrangement. "I need you to look at something," Paige said. "I want you to look at it before I say anything about it, because I want to hear what you see without me having framed it first." She sent him a PDF. Marcus opened it and read through it for 6 minutes without speaking, which was how long it took him to understand the structure of what he was looking at. Serena had, over a period of 14 months, made a series of transfers from a joint household account into a separately established account in her name only, 14 transfers, each below the reporting threshold, totaling $218,000. The transfers were methodical. They were spaced at irregular intervals, which suggested they were designed to avoid pattern detection. 3 of the transfers corresponded in date to weekends when Marcus had been traveling for work. The account the money had moved into had in turn made 2 outbound wire transfers, one to an entity called Voss Strategic Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware 11 months earlier, and one to a personal account that traced through 2 layers of intermediary LLCs to the same registered agent. Marcus set the phone down on his desk, screen facing up. He looked at it for a moment without picking it up again. "You still there?" Paige asked. "I'm here," he said. "I need you to know I found this because of routine pattern work. I wasn't looking for anything specific." "I know," Marcus said. "That's the only reason you found it." He asked her to hold everything and not document further until he called her back. He set the phone on his desk and walked to the window of the building he managed operationally, the building that, if anyone had checked the ownership records, was held by a trust that in turn was held by a parent entity whose beneficial owner was Marcus Hale. And he looked at the street below for approximately 3 minutes. What he felt was not what most people would expect. He'd imagined something like this, in the abstract, since the Whitmore years. He'd carried the possibility of it the way a man carries a word in a foreign language that he's never needed to use but never forgot. Ready, dormant, positioned. What he felt now was something closer to the specific sadness of a calculation being confirmed, which is different from grief and different from shock and significantly harder to describe. He called Oliver Reed. Oliver answered on the second ring, which he always did during business hours. "I need to talk," Marcus said. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Oliver said. Oliver Reed arrived carrying a leather folio that he set on Marcus's kitchen table and did not open for the first 20 minutes. Because the first thing Oliver did in any situation was listen. He was 52 years old, had worked as Marcus's attorney since the Reconstruction period, and had a particular quality that Marcus had come to rely on over 9 years, which was that Oliver never performed alarm. He registered information and he worked with it. That was all he did. Marcus walked him through what Paige had found. Oliver listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Oliver opened the folio and took out a yellow legal pad and wrote 3 words at the top of it, which Marcus couldn't read from where he was sitting, but which Oliver later told him were the words, establish, document, wait. "My first question," Oliver said, "is whether you want to know the full scope before you act, or whether you want to act on what you know now." "I want the full scope," Marcus said. "That's going to take time." "I know, and during that time you're going to have to maintain a normal surface." I know, Marcus said again. Oliver looked at him for a moment. You can do that? Marcus said he could. He had been maintaining a normal surface for 4 years inside a marriage that had begun eroding in the second year. He was practiced. Oliver left that evening with the PDF, a copy of the account records Paige had assembled, and a list of 9 specific pieces of documentation he was going to need in order to build a complete picture of Voss Strategic Holdings and its connection to Damien Voss's claimed financial identity. He was precise about the list. He read each item aloud while Marcus wrote it down, which was a habit they'd developed during the Whitmore litigation because writing things down by hand, Oliver had always argued, committed them to memory in a way that reading didn't. 3 days later, Oliver called with the first piece of information that changed the shape of the situation from a personal betrayal into something considerably larger. Damien Voss, it turned out, was not worth $340 million or anything adjacent to it. Damien Voss was a man who had, over a period of 7 years, built a practice of identifying wealthy women with access to joint financial accounts and constructing an identity credible enough to attract a level of investment that would cover his operating costs while he maneuvered toward a larger target. His name was legitimate. His background in finance was legitimate, or had been. He had worked for 14 months at a real private equity firm before being let go for conduct issues the firm had declined to publicize. What he had built since then was a performance, sustained by a network of carefully maintained appearances, the Watch, a leased apartment in a building with the right address, a collection of confident references to deals that either didn't exist or had existed and hadn't involved him. The larger target in this instance was Marcus. Oliver explained this on the phone with the flat precision of someone delivering a weather report. He's been using Serena as a pathway, Oliver said. The Voss Strategic Holdings entity is positioned to submit a bid on a commercial property portfolio that is currently in acquisition discussions, a portfolio that, if you check the counterparty records, is controlled by one of your holding structures. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thinks he's going to acquire a piece of something I own, Marcus said, without knowing that I own it. That is what the documentation indicates, Oliver said. Marcus sat with that information for a moment. There was something almost elegant about it in the way that certain structural failures are elegant, a kind of inverted precision. A plan that would have worked perfectly if the person at its center had been exactly who he appeared to be. How much time before the bid submission? Marcus asked. 7 weeks, Oliver said. The formal event is a board reception the portfolio managers are hosting to review acquisition interest. It's a fairly public occasion. Several parties have already confirmed attendance. Marcus asked Oliver to get him the guest list. He looked at the confirmed attendees when Oliver sent it 2 days later. Serena Caldwell Hale was on it, listed as a +1 to a confirmed attendee named Damien Voss. Marcus stared at his own name on the same list, confirmed in his capacity as a representative of the holding structure, and registered a feeling that was not quite irony and not quite satisfaction, but occupied the space between them. Oliver, he said during their next call, I want to attend. I assumed you would, Oliver said. I want to be there when he walks in. Also assumed, Oliver said. I've taken the liberty of confirming your attendance under your full name and title as managing principal. The reception committee will know who you are. Good, Marcus said. There was a pause. Marcus, Oliver said. You understand you could also simply file the fraud documentation and let the legal process handle it. I know. The outcome would be the same, less exposure. I know that too, Marcus said, but I've spent 11 months watching a man sit across a dinner table from me and calculate that I'm not a factor. I'd like him to have that corrected in person. Oliver didn't argue. That was also something Marcus had come to appreciate about Oliver Reed. He understood the difference between advice and instruction, and he gave the former only once. Over the following 5 weeks, Paige Kessler assembled a forensic account of every transaction that ran through Voss Strategic Holdings, cross-referenced against Damien Voss's social and professional record, and produced a document that ran to 61 pages and contained a level of specificity that Oliver described as presentation ready, by which he meant ready to be placed in front of a judge, a board, or a room full of people who needed to understand something quickly and completely. There was a moment during the 4th week of that period, on a Thursday evening. While Serena was out at a dinner she'd described as a client event, and which Oliver had confirmed was in fact a dinner with Damien Voss at a restaurant 40 minutes from their apartment, when Marcus sat at his kitchen table and held a pocket compass that had belonged to his grandfather, a man named Arthur Hale who had worked survey crews for 40 years, and who had given Marcus the compass the summer Marcus turned 12 with the instruction that it was for when you're not sure which direction is true. The compass had sat in the top drawer of every desk Marcus had worked at since that summer. He'd moved it through 4 offices and 2 residences. He held it now, its brass case warm from the drawer, and turned it over in his hand and set it on the table face up and watched the needle find north. He could have gone to that restaurant. He could have walked through the door and said something that ended things that night. He'd thought about it. He'd mapped the conversation in his head while driving home from the facility earlier that evening. Rehearsed versions of it, tested outcomes, and then he'd made the decision he always made when the impulse to move early was strongest, which was to hold still and let the situation finish becoming what it was going to be. The compass needle found its bearing. Marcus put it back in the drawer and went to bed. The board reception was held on a Friday evening in the top-floor event space of a building Marcus had toured 6 years earlier when it first came onto the market, and had decided not to acquire because the structural inspection had revealed deferred maintenance he wasn't willing to inherit. The irony of that specific building as the setting was the kind of detail that Marcus would have appreciated in a novel and simply noted as fact in real life. He arrived 17 minutes before the scheduled start, shook hands with the 2 board members he knew by name, accepted a glass of sparkling water, and positioned himself near the east-facing windows where the view was good and the sightlines across the room were better. Oliver arrived 4 minutes after Marcus and stood nearby without appearing to be with him. The room filled gradually. Marcus recognized 6 of the other attendees, 3 from existing professional relationships, 2 from the sort of industry events where faces become familiar without conversations ever becoming substantive, and 1 from a litigation his holding structure had been tangentially involved in 3 years earlier. He greeted the ones he knew. He was pleasant. He was completely unremarkable in the way he had learned to be unremarkable, which required more active effort than people assumed but produced a quality of invisibility that was, he had found, its own kind of power. Damien Voss arrived at 22 minutes past the start time, which was a calibrated entry, late enough to be noticed, not so late as to be impolite. He was wearing a dark suit that was well made and clearly recent, and the watch was on his left wrist exactly where it always was, and he moved through the entry with the practiced ease of a man who has attended many rooms like this one and knows how to enter them at the correct angle. Serena was on his arm. She was wearing the blue dress she had bought for a corporate dinner the previous spring, and she was smiling the particular smile she used in professional settings, genuine enough on the surface, maintained with awareness beneath it. She scanned the room as they entered with the automatic assessment of someone accustomed to reading social environments. She did not immediately look at the east windows. Damien did. Marcus watched Damien's gaze move across the room in the methodical way of someone taking inventory, noting who was present, calibrating the environment, positioning himself. The gaze reached the east windows and found Marcus. Damien Voss stopped moving. It was a small stop, a fraction of a second interruption in his forward momentum that most people in a busy room wouldn't register. Serena was still looking elsewhere. She felt him pause and glanced up at him, and he covered the pause with a slight adjustment, a turn that made it look like he was orienting toward a specific point in the room, which he was. He leaned toward Serena and said something. Marcus was too far to hear it, but he watched Serena follow Damien's eyeline and find her husband standing at the east windows in a group of people that included 2 members of the board, and he watched her face go through 3 distinct expressions in the span of about 2 seconds: recognition, confusion, and then a kind of mental recalibration that she was good at but not good enough at too. Fully concealed from someone who'd spent 4 years learning to read it, she crossed the room. Damien, after a very brief hesitation, followed. Marcus, Serena said, and her voice had the specific evenness of someone choosing each word carefully. I didn't know you'd be here. I was invited, Marcus said. The reception committee reached out through the management office. Serena blinked. Just once, but deliberately. She turned slightly and extended a hand toward Damien, a gesture that was meant to look casual and landed somewhere adjacent to that. This is Damien Voss. I've mentioned him, he's in private equity. Damien, this is my husband Marcus. Damien Voss extended his hand. He was good. Marcus gave him that. There was almost no visible seam in the performance, the handshake was firm, the eye contact was steady, the smile was exactly calibrated between warmth and professional respect. Almost no visible seam. "I'm sure you've heard the name," Damien said, and Marcus recognized the line because he'd heard it before, a year and a half earlier, at a gallery opening, delivered to someone else. "Can't say I have," Marcus said. Something moved across Damien's expression, not quite fear and not quite recognition, but the early warning sensation of a man whose calculation about a room has just turned out to be wrong in a way he can't yet fully measure. "Then you're one of the few," Damien said. The same line, same sequence. Marcus had the particular understanding of a man watching a script play itself out in a context for which it was no longer appropriate, and he let it finish. "Marcus," said a voice from behind him, and he turned to find David Kane, the board chair, extending his hand. "Glad you made it. I was hoping we'd get a chance to speak before the presentations begin." "Of course," Marcus said. He turned back to Serena and Damien with the polite smile of a man with somewhere else to be. "Excuse me." He walked with David Kane toward the far end of the room, and as he went he heard Serena, very quietly, say Damien's name in a tone that was not a question and not a statement, and contained something that sounded like the beginning of an understanding she hadn't finished having yet. The formal portion of the reception began 31 minutes later. Marcus sat at the board table. Oliver sat 2 seats to his left. Damien Voss and Serena were in the row of chairs arranged along the periphery of the room for non-board attendees. The board chair stood and welcomed the assembled parties and outlined the purpose of the evening, which was to review expressions of acquisition interest in a portfolio of 14 commercial properties currently held under the management of a principal he then named, and the name he used was not a holding structure name or a trust name or a management entity designation. The name he used was Marcus Hale. The room shifted in a small but perceptible way. Several people nodded. 2 made notes. One leaned to a colleague and said something too quiet to hear across the room. Damien Voss did not move for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked down at the materials in front of him on the chair's small side table. Then he looked at Serena. Serena was looking at the board chair as if she had not yet fully processed the name she'd just heard, which was her husband's. Spoken in a room she'd come to as someone else's +1 in connection with a portfolio she believed Damien was positioning to acquire through her assistance, and a loan she'd funded from $218,000 she had moved without Marcus's knowledge into an account designed to be difficult to trace. She turned slowly toward Marcus. He met her eyes for a moment. Then he returned his attention to the board chair, who was still speaking. The documents went to Damien Voss's attorney on the following Monday morning. Oliver delivered them electronically with a cover letter that was 4 sentences long and that Marcus reviewed and approved on Sunday afternoon sitting at his kitchen table with the brass compass on the surface in front of him, its needle pointing where it always pointed. The documents were comprehensive. Paige Kessler had done work that Marcus would later describe to her as the best forensic reconstruction he'd seen since the aftermath of the Whitmore dissolution, which was, from Marcus, the highest available compliment. The 61-page report documented 14 months of transaction history, cross-referenced against Voss Strategic Holdings' public filings, and appended to that were 3 sworn declarations from individuals Damien had approached with variations of the same investment framework in previous years, 2 of them women in professional settings who had been reached through cold outreach that began as networking and escalated by managed stages into financial relationships. Structured identically to the one he'd been building with Serena, the pattern was not incidental, it was a practice. One of the 3 previous targets had lost $74,000 through a transaction she described in her declaration as having been framed to her as a partnership in a development project that turned out not to exist in the form she'd been shown. A second had transferred $130,000 to an entity that had been dissolved without notice 14 months after the transfer. The third had caught the irregularity early and exited with a modest loss she'd absorbed quietly because she'd been too embarrassed to pursue the matter, until Paige's outreach connected her to Oliver. And Oliver explained that her declaration would help prevent the same thing from happening to others, and she agreed. The cover letter noted that if Damien Voss elected to pursue any claim against Marcus's holdings through any legal or commercial mechanism, the full 61-page report, along with all supporting declarations, would be filed with the relevant state financial regulatory authority within 5 business days. The cover letter also noted that Marcus was prepared, absent any further action from Damien, to confine the disclosure to what was strictly necessary for the civil recovery of the $218,000 and to decline to pursue the matter through criminal channels, provided Damien settled the full amount within 30 days and signed a non-compete covenant preventing him from engaging in acquisition activities touching any entity connected to Marcus's holdings for a period of 7 years. Damien's attorney responded 9 days later. The settlement terms were accepted in full. Marcus read the acceptance confirmation on his laptop at the diner counter where he ate lunch 3 days a week, at the same seat he always occupied on a Tuesday afternoon. He finished his soup. He left the same tip he always left, which was 22% because he'd worked out once what 20% came to and simply added $1. He drove home in the Tacoma with the cracked mirror. Serena had moved out 3 weeks earlier, 11 days after the reception. She'd taken what was hers and left what wasn't, and the conversation they'd had before she left was quiet and factual and brief, in the way that conversations are when both people already know everything that needs to be known and there's nothing left that words can clarify. Marcus had told her that he wasn't going to pursue the $218,000 through channels that would require her to be named in a filing, provided the money was returned through Oliver's trust account by the end of the month. She asked him why he was offering her that. He said it was because he'd decided it was the correct amount of damage and he wasn't interested in going further than that. She looked at him for a moment in the way she'd occasionally looked at him across dinner tables in the early years when she was trying to understand something about him that wouldn't resolve into a simple category. "I didn't know," she said, "about what he actually was, what he was actually doing." "I know," Marcus said. He believed that was true. He'd thought about it enough and examined enough of the transaction record to understand that Serena had believed she was helping a wealthy man acquire a legitimate asset and taking a share of the return, that she hadn't known Damien was targeting Marcus specifically. Hadn't known about the previous targets, hadn't known the full shape of what she'd walked into. She'd known she was transferring money without Marcus's knowledge, and that she'd been doing it inside a marriage that she'd been reconsidering for 2 years. That was enough to end the marriage. It wasn't enough to bury her. She transferred the $218,000 to Oliver's trust account on the 27th day of the 30-day window. Oliver confirmed receipt and sent Marcus a brief email with the confirmation number and the words, "Account settled. You're clear." Marcus's holding structure employed at that point 847 people across its various operating entities, facilities staff, property managers, administrative support, site supervisors, contractors on long-term agreements, people who went to work every day in buildings maintained by companies that paid their salaries reliably and whose jobs depended on those companies continuing to be run by someone who made decisions based on complete information rather than emotional momentum. Marcus had thought about those 847 people during the 5 weeks between the discovery and the reception, on several evenings when the temptation to move early and expose everything at once had been strongest. He'd thought about what a messy, public, legally complicated unwinding of the situation would cost. Not him, but them. The steady payroll. The benefits. The manager at the industrial corridor facility who had 3 children and had been with the company for 11 years and who would be working somewhere else within 6 months if the company's operations were disrupted by a high-profile fraud case with Marcus's name prominently attached. Restraint is usually described as the thing you feel when you don't act. Marcus had found it to be something different, a specific decision made deliberately with a reason attached to it. He'd chosen not to go further than justice required because he'd identified what justice required and measured it against what further would cost and decided the math didn't work in anyone's favor. That was all. It wasn't generosity, it was accuracy. The brass compass sat on his desk in the facility's management office now, moved there from the drawer at home. A location change he'd made the morning after the reception, when he'd come in early to review the documentation one more time before Oliver filed it. He'd set it on the edge of the desk where the light from the window caught the case in the morning, and it had stayed there. He'd told the story of the compass to Serena once, early in the marriage, told her about his grandfather Arthur, the survey cruise, the summer he turned 12. The instruction about finding true north when you weren't sure which direction was true. She'd found it charming. He'd meant it as something more than that, but hadn't had a way to say what the something more was without explaining things he wasn't ready to explain. He thought about that sometimes. He thought about the things that had been left as partial pictures because he'd learned after the Whitmore settlement that partial pictures were safer than complete ones. And about the cost that calculus had carried into a marriage that might have survived full honesty and might not have, but had certainly not survived the partial kind. He was not certain what he would do differently. He was not certain he could have done differently, given what he knew at each point when a decision had been required. What he was certain of was that he was 41 years old with an intact business, a clear legal record, a compass on the edge of his desk, and the specific, unperformed freedom of a man who'd stopped carrying something heavy. He went back to work. There was a facility on the east side of the district whose roof inspection was overdue, and he had an appointment to walk it at 2 in the afternoon. He drove the Tacoma with the cracked mirror. The needle on the compass in the management office pointed where it always pointed, steady in its bearing, not requiring anything from him. If this story stayed with you, I want to tell you what I think it's actually about. It's not about the money. It was never about the money. The specific number, $218,000, $340 million, the entire portfolio, those figures matter to the legal record and almost nowhere else. What the story is about is the cost of the partial picture. Marcus built a life around an incomplete version of himself because he'd been damaged by someone who'd taken advantage of the complete version. And that protective incompleteness created a gap that someone else eventually walked through. The partial picture didn't just protect him, it also prevented the people around him from ever fully knowing what they were choosing when they chose him or chose not to. The object that keeps returning in a story like this is never really an object. Arthur Hale's compass is a question repeated across a lifetime. Which direction is true? Not which direction is safe, not which direction is impressive, not which direction will look right from outside, which direction is true. Marcus spent 4 years in a marriage maintaining the wrong bearing, not out of deception but out of a habit of protection so practiced it had become invisible to him. He only recognized it clearly when he was sitting at his kitchen table at 11 at night with the compass in his hand and his wife at dinner with someone who was using her to reach something she didn't know he owned. The correct direction, when Marcus finally found it, wasn't the one that would produce the most dramatic consequence or the most complete legal exposure of everyone who had treated him as a minor variable. It was the one that cleared the debt, protected the 847 people who showed up to work every morning, and left him standing in a management office with his grandfather's compass and nothing to explain to anyone. You don't have to be secretly wealthy to be treated as if you're worth less than you are. That happens at every scale. What the story is really asking, and what I want to leave you with, is whether you've taken the time to know your own bearing. Not the version of yourself that's easiest to maintain in public, or the one that's been shaped by whoever last told you who you were. The actual one. The one the needle finds when everything else stops moving. That's the story this week. If it's the kind of thing that makes you want to come back, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week, and we're just getting started. Share it with someone who'd understand why Marcus waited instead of confronting early, instead of going further than justice required. And if you've ever had to choose between exposing everything and protecting the people who'd be caught in the fallout, leave that in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know what you chose, and why.